Mike?
Thank you. Yeah, the starting point for our foundation was to look and with the view that lives have equal value to see where we weren't adhering to that. And so we looked at things like childhood death and saw that in many African countries at the turn of the century, you still had a quarter of the children dying before the age of 5. And you had definite contradictions that a lot of these deaths were from diarrhea, and there actually was a vaccine for rotavirus, which is half of all of those diarrheal deaths, and the vaccines were being given to kids in rich countries, but not to the kids in the poor countries. Kids in rich countries aren't at much risk of dying of rotavirus. They just get sick, and it's great to avoid that, but it wasn't where you could actually save lives. And so seeing inequities like that, we decided to focus, and a lot of the focus on health, but now more on agriculture. That ends up, if you want to save those lives and improve health systems, you end up doing a lot of work in Asia and a lot of work in Africa. Asia's made incredible progress. We still do great work there, but the Indian health statistics have improved dramatically. Places like Indonesia, Vietnam, also dramatically. And those countries are in the virtuous cycle that if you invest in human capital, which means health, nutrition's a big part of that, and education, then you lift up your economy and you no longer need aid. You let the aid go to the countries who are still further behind. So Asia is mostly a good news story. Not in Yemen and Pakistan right now is troubled, but overall, those economies have done well. And so more and more, the challenges of Africa. Africa has malaria, TB, HIV, it's got neglected diseases. It has a kind of unique burden, and yet the highest population growth in the world is in Africa. In fact, there'll be more new people born in Africa than anywhere else in the world. Asia still has a tiny bit of population growth. We'll add 1 billion people, but Africa will add 2 billion people. And so it's been great that between 2000 and now, things like the Global Alliance for Vaccines that buys those rotavirus vaccines and is now getting them out to most of the children in the world, the Global Fund, which has worked on HIV drugs, malaria bed nets. The situation in Africa is now that only 10% of kids die before the age of 5 in sub-Saharan Africa. It's 1% in rich countries, so we still have this huge gap, but dropping the African number from 20% to 10%, and the global number from 10%, which is over 10 million lives here, down to 5%, that's one of the greatest achievements humanity's ever done. And so, we have a still deep inequities, but we have some examples of where we've done well. The reason I'm so glad you're here and that we're highlighting Africa to some degree is that the next decade in Africa, that progress will slow down and in some cases go into reverse. And why is that? Well, the total amount of aid going into Africa sadly will go down. If you take aid budgets and you say Ukraine's a huge priority, which I'm not disagreeing with, and Ukraine includes civilian support, refugee costs, and then the overall government budget between electricity costs, defense costs, that is a new demand. And even though countries like Germany have raised their aid budget quite a bit over the last decade, it does mean even here, the portion that goes to Africa, the absolute amount that goes to Africa will be down. And so we're gonna have to be very careful how we spend that money. But it's not just aid. Aid is part of a big equation, but Africa's also experiencing energy costs as very expensive. that means not just energy, but it means fertilizer. Fertilizer is key to agricultural productivity. Agricultural productivity is key to avoid starvation and malnutrition. That's a huge impact on health. And so you can say it's a triple threat, the threat of the energy costs, the food costs, and the health things. And then finally, you have the turn of the economic cycle where interest rates are very high. And so the amount of financing, net financing that goes into Africa will go down quite a bit. And in fact, their debt levels, which in the late 90s, there was great work done, those were brought down. Now they've gone back to record levels. And, so you're having to, you want to work out those debts. Sadly, it's not as simple this time as last time because you have Chinese creditors that are complex, you have private creditors that are complex. So, Africa's important because over half the children will be born there. We should care for a humanitarian point of view. Sadly, most of the economic potential there is just in minerals. Until we get the human development up and the infrastructure up, their opportunity to participate in the global economy is tough. We have one goal, which is to make Africa food sufficient so that they're not a net food importer, and that if we invest in innovation, that's very possible. So, I do think we can get back on track. I do think it's important, but we have to be honest that climate, economics, aid reduction, debts, all of these things are working against Africa in this next decade.
We got now the big broad picture, and Bill Gates now said the challenge is Africa, and in the next decades, progress will slow down. Mrs. Urpilainen, you have visited Namibia and South Africa at the end of January to enhance the ties between Europe and African countries. So from your perspective, why is it so important to build inclusive partnerships, and which role plays the government's aspect?
Well, good morning from Brussels, and thank you for this opportunity to give me an opportunity to participate virtually. I really was looking forward to being there in person, but because of the strike, unfortunately, that was not possible. Indeed, I think Bill described very well, the different challenges Africa is facing at the moment. I think firstly, it's good to look at the big picture, the geopolitics. We live in a world which never has been so interconnected. About 70% of international trade today really involves global value chains. Foreign direct investments reach $1.6 trillion in 2021. On the other hand, we live in a world which has never been so fragile because of long-term challenges of climate change, evolving digital technologies, demographics imbalances, together with short-term shocks such as the COVID pandemic and now the Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And of course, I have to admit that the Russia's aggression against Ukraine has been a huge shock to all of us in Europe. I never thought that we would see a war in our continent in my lifetime again. But what is important to remember is that even though we have, of course, helped a lot Ukraine in terms of humanitarian assistance, in terms of military equipment, in terms of macro-financial assistance, we have not turned our back to the rest of the world. So if I look at the EU budget and our financial commitments, we have kept all our promises. We have not cut our financial support to the global south, including Africa. Why? Because we definitely understand that the war is taking place in the European soil, but the crisis is very much global. So, of course, our partners in Africa, in many countries, they face the consequences, the negative consequences of this war in terms of food security, energy crisis, high inflation, and so forth. And that's why it has been so important also to reach out our partners and explain to them that we are here in order to help them also to address those different challenges Bill very well already described. Why Africa is important to us? Of course, Africa is our neighbor. There is 1.3 billion citizens in that continent, and 70% of them are under 30 years old. So it is, of course, our moral and ethic obligation to try to provide and support sustainable development in that continent. But on the other hand, it's of course also our own interest. And that's why the European Union is investing a lot in Africa. We want to support green and digital transitions in that continent. In a similar way, we are very much focusing on those transitions within Europe. In addition to that, we also want to invest in human development, because we know that there is no sustainable future without education, without sustainable healthcare systems. So that's why 20% of our funding actually goes to human development. What is the new element of our partnership is that we really want to create inclusive partnership. So not only like between the governments, between the political leaders, between the political systems, but we also want to bring civil society organizations and the private sector on board. Because as a former finance minister, I think we all realize the fact that we are not able to reach sustainable development goals without private sector involvement. We need also private funding. And for us, the tool to get private companies to invest in Africa and also in other regions in the global south is Global Gateway Strategy. So this is the strategy through which we encourage also our member states and their private companies to invest in Africa and also accelerate the green and digital transitions in the global south countries, including Africa states. And that was one of the reasons I visited in Namibia, where we are now moving forward with green hydrogen, but also with critical raw materials. And the idea is really not to, get critical raw materials from Namibia, put them to the ship, and then, take them to Europe. No, this is not the idea. What we want to do is that through our investments, we also want to create value in our partner countries, like in Namibia. And it means that we are investing in the ecosystem, so that we are looking at the skills side, so the education side. We are looking at the regulatory aspects. We are looking at the institutions, which also creates the business environment. And of course, in addition to that, we are also looking at the clear infrastructure. And the memorandum of understanding was signed by the President von der Leyen in the COP27. And now we are creating a clear roadmap to implement that memorandum of understanding together with the government of Namibia. That's one example, but there are several examples. I'm happy to explain a bit more later.
We will talk about partnerships and that aspect later, definitely. But Mr. Fuest, we have heard now something about the importance of direct investments, about trades. We have already heard some figures. But now, from an economic perspective, why is it so interesting now to think about the EU-African relationship?
Well, I think it's interesting and important because we normally don't think enough about this relationship, and I think it's important because what we see currently in the world is that international cooperation is falling apart. So the issues we face, like health, pandemics, climate change. These are global issues, we all understand that, but what we're experiencing at the moment, what we're seeing is that cooperation between countries, and that is mostly cooperation between governments, is getting more and more difficult. Cooperation with China is becoming more and more difficult, not speaking of Russia and so on. So this is one side, and then we simply do not think enough about the potentials and the issues also in our relation to Africa. And I think the reason is very simple. If you think about the economics or the current economic weight of Africa, it's relatively small. So we've just heard there are 1.3 billion people, so it's comparable to China in terms of population. If you think about GDP, so the economic weight, overall GDP of Africa is 3,000 billion euros. That's 3/4 of German GDP. So we have 80 million people here. Africa has 15 times as many, but its GDP is smaller. So it's a relatively, in economic terms, it's a relatively small place, but it's an entire continent. It's 1.3 billion people. And of course, Africa is very heterogeneous. Then we do have trade, economic relations to the northern African countries, which are more developed. But if you think about if you look at Africa as a whole, sub-Saharan Africa is more than 90% of the population. So over 1 billion people are living in sub-Saharan Africa. So 1/3 of Africa's GDP is in the north. So sub-Saharan Africa has 90% of the people, but only 60% of the GDP. And within sub-Saharan Africa, there are huge differences. The poorest country is Burundi. Its annual per capita GDP is $780. That's very low. If you compare that to South Africa, it's 20 times as much. South Africa is also part of sub-Saharan Africa. It's, again, in terms of population, a relatively small country, but its GDP per capita is $15,000. So it's an emerging economy. It has a totally different level of development. And in fact, if we look at our trade with sub-Saharan Africa, more than 1 billion people, it's smaller than, by our trade, I mean German trade with sub-Saharan Africa, it's smaller than our trade with Ireland. 5 million people, okay? So, what this tells us, I suppose, is the potential is just enormous. But it's out there, and because it hasn't been realized, we don't think so much about Africa. Our understanding is limited, and I think one of the challenges, really, looking ahead, or maybe I should mention 2 challenges. One country, we've talked about that already, which is very active in Africa, is China. But the Chinese approach to development, to economic relations, also to debt, is very different and in parts problematic. If you look at the contracts, for instance, between China and these countries, the debt contracts, there have been studies now where these contracts have been published, and the Chinese government really tries very hard to make sure they get their money back and to never forgive debt. They don't participate in negotiations between the creditors, and that will make life very difficult, as Bill just mentioned, for the debtors. So we need to think hard about Chinese influence in sub-Saharan Africa. Almost 1/5 of the imports comes from China. The US has a share of 5%. So the US, in terms of economic presence in sub-Saharan Africa, is relatively small compared to China. Together with Europe, it basically matches the Chinese influence. Last point I would like to make, I think we need to talk more about Africa, also because we need to understand them better. I mean, we are doing, I think this is a great initiative, going there and saying, okay, we want to support the green and the digital, but if you think about what we're doing at home, this is exactly what we're doing at home. So this is our way of thinking what the real issues are, but I think we need to understand what the Africans what the Africans think the issues are, and maybe it's more related to more basic things like you mentioned, food, health. I'm not sure how interested they are in the green transition, I have to say. I'm not entirely sure.
But after getting the broad pictures, let's talk now more about practical things. What can be done on a concrete level? Mr. Gates, when we focus now on partnerships, you went to Kenya last November, your first trip after the COVID-19 pandemic, and you announced there that you want, or your foundation wants to spend almost $7 billion in the next 4 years. So when it comes to solution in the sector of health, agriculture, gender equality in Africa, which role or does innovation play?
Well, one of the big causes of malnutrition is that the food sector in Africa is very weak. The access to credit, the productivity per acre is less than a quarter of Europe. Africa should be a huge net food exporter, but their ecosystems are different than the temperate zone ecosystems. And so tragically, the work that was done mostly for Asia in the Green Revolution of the 1970s, where the seeds were improved very dramatically and the predictions of mass starvation were avoided, particularly in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. That work has never been done for Africa. They have different ecosystems and a wider variety of crops than just the big three. So things like sorghum, millet, chickpea, sweet potato are all very important. The system that funds that agriculture research gets less than $1 billion a year. And in the face of climate, it's even more urgent to change those seeds. The closer you are to the equator, the more climate is a problem. And if you work outdoors and you're dependent on the weather, the more climate is a problem. Well, who works outdoors? It's farmers. Your picture of a poor person should be somebody with a very small farm where they're mostly growing the food they eat on that farm. And so these weather conditions will make there be a lot more years where the output is either very, very low or zero. They need better crops. There are digital systems to advise them when to plant and how to deal with various challenges. That's working well. We do more soil mapping so they can decide what fertilizer to use. But for example, this year, half as much fertilizer is being used. You know, when the fertilizer market output goes down, you have to say to yourself, not only does the price go up, but somebody doesn't use fertilizer. I mean, there's less fertilizer. And in this case, it's totally Africa is where all that fertilizer use has gone down. European farmers, I'm not saying it's easy for them, but they pay up because they have end markets, which is why you have food inflation that ends up reimbursing that. But the credit structures don't exist, and so Africa is priced out, which means their future food productivity will be even lower. The good news is that we can make far better seeds, we can build digital credit systems, we can build digital advice systems. So before these headwinds came along, we were increasing African agriculture productivity. Finally, the world should fund, because of its climate focus, it should fund the seed innovation system at about $2 billion a year, which is a substantial increase. We also now understand malnutrition far better in terms of what we need to do for both mothers, which are very important, and for kids. And that has to do with various foods and the food mix. So it's not a completely bleak picture. You know, whatever resources get into these African countries, we can have more impact. Eventually, the solution for Africa is to be part of private sector trade, but it's hard to overstate in many cases how far we are away from getting more than just pure minerals extraction out of these countries. We have a map that shows involved. So productivity, fertilizer, and infrastructure, while we invest in the humans, which is the education, malnutrition, health stuff. So I do think we'll get back on track. I mean, the world The war will end. These debt problems, I hope we can resolve them. People should be more outraged at how slow the debt resolution is taking place, but people don't know who to blame, and it's fairly complicated. I mean, even I have to be educated about, okay, what's this balance sheet? And these Chinese entities, are they government? Are they private? And that's partly the opaqueness hurts the moral message that should be very strong.
The moral message you, Mrs. Urpilainen, stressed the obligation to support African countries. The chairperson of the African Union, Mustafaki Mahamat, said during his recent trip to Brussels, it's important to have a partnership of equals. And you also mentioned in your first statement, you stressed it, that's important to have inclusive cooperation. But how can you really guarantee this form of partnership of equals?
Well, this is our objective. We definitely want to have a partnership of equals with African states and African countries. And how we do that is, of course, through the dialogue. And I think it was mentioned already here that we have to listen to the leaders and the different society representatives, including young people in Africa, and we are doing that. So, of course, when we are, for instance, planning a different project for Africa, we are always consulting different stakeholders in that country. It is also true, and it is a reality, that there is a huge geopolitical competition in Africa, in many parts of Africa. Now we see that in Sahel, but we can also see that in the Horn of Africa. And our approach, the European approach, has been that we want to strengthen and improve the strategic autonomy in Africa. Because what we learned in the middle of the pandemic was that Africa, for instance, imports still 99% of the vaccines it uses. Africa imports still 94% of the medicines it uses. So what we did in the middle of the COVID was that we created this initiative together with our member states and also their companies to start pharmaceutical manufacturing in Africa for Africa. So with 4 countries, we have been now working in order to start produce first vaccines and hopefully in the future other medicines in Africa for Africa. And it was a similar kind of, I would say, example now when Russia decided to attack Ukraine, and we learned that Africa still imports food to the continent. And we, of course, felt obligation to help our African partners by providing humanitarian assistance, by providing also food, but first of all, also start to support their capacity to produce more food and support their agriculture and agricultural system. So I think our approach is precisely to try to strengthen the resilience of Africa in order to improve their strategic autonomy, because we know that they are still very much dependent on import in many sectors. Are they interested in green transition? Yes, they are. I give you one example. Africa still is a continent where half of the citizens do not have access to electricity. I visited Malawi, very, very beautiful country. 13% of the citizens have access to electricity. Of course, it is their interest to be able to provide access to electricity and renewable energy resources. So energy which is also produced by renewable energy resources, because Africa hosts 60% of the best solar resources and 30% of the mineral essential for the green transition. So they have all the opportunities. What do they need? Of course, is investments in infrastructure and also investments in human capital and human development. And that's why I give you one example. I recently launched an initiative in South Africa where we are precisely focusing on teacher training. because there is a lack of 15 million new teachers in Africa by the year 2030. And that's why we need to, for instance, to be able to train and educate more teachers, but also improve the quality of the teacher training so that, pupils, they really, are able to get high quality education. So I think we can not only focus on hard infrastructure, we definitely have to also look at the soft connectivity and soft infrastructure like human development, including health, research, and education.
We have heard some practical examples from the Commissioner, Mr. Fuest, and there is the Global Gateway African-European Investment Package worth 115 billion euro. So we have talked also about the transition, green deal. So from your perspective, what are the hurdles?
It's not the first program we do for Africa. We've done a lot at the national level. The member states have seen a lot of these programs, and this is now another approach. I think, as the Commissioner just mentioned, one of the key challenges is really how do we make sure that there is, as it's called, ownership of these programs in the countries where they take place. So one way of doing this is trying to listen not just to governments, but also to other stakeholders, to civil society organizations. But if you do that, one issue you face is that you talk to areas and groups that have some form of capacity of organizing themselves. So where this aid is really needed is maybe somewhere else. So it's this, of course, organizations in these countries are aware of this, but one experience we have with our own programs for Europe, if we think about our own regional policy programs and our own green transition funds and so on, money tends to go to the strong places, because to interact, the mere ability to interact with organizations offering these complex subsidy programs creates a bias towards places where you have capacity. So how do you make sure these programs are really inclusive? It's very tricky, and of course that's related to the governance of these countries. So there are countries with a more or less reasonably working governance, and those countries you need to approach differently from countries where you don't have that governance. And this is very tricky. Maybe one issue also a question maybe to you, Commissioner, is do we have operational objectives in these programs, and related to that, do we have mechanisms for independent evaluation? It's something that's missing from a lot of European and national programs. It's not specific to European programs, but do we have independent evaluations, and have evaluations of past programs gone into the design of this program?
Do you want to pick up this question directly, Mrs. Urpilainen?
Yes, I can do that. And I would also like to mention that, yes, that's true that we have had also different initiatives in our history and past. But what is the difference now with this Global Gateway strategy? First of all, it's very much based on the cooperation between the European Commission and the member states. So this kind of Team Europe approach. I can tell you that still 4 years ago, there was very little coordination between the European member states and the Commission at the country level. I know that Germany is a big provider of developing cooperation funding, for instance, in many African countries. It's very similar to France and some other European Union member states, but there was very little coordination, who does what and what are the political priorities. Now, luckily, we have changed this. We created this Team Europe approach, where also at the country level, we set common priorities, common political objectives, and we work together, we coordinate our actions, and we also pool resources. So this is a huge step forward. And this is also the concept of Global Gateway. In addition to that, first time ever, we have a concept and strategy where we also work together with the private sector. so that it's not only taxpayers' money, it's not only public funding, but in addition to that, we also bring through our DFIs private companies to invest in Africa in sustainable development goals. So this is, from my perspective, a great achievement, and I'm very much looking at the implementation phase at the moment. Do we have indicators? Do we have evaluations? Yes, we do. And this is important, especially when it comes to budget support modality, which we still use. There has to be very clear objectives, very clear practical objectives and indicators, and there have to be also strong monitoring, because otherwise it's very difficult to explain to our taxpayers in Europe why their money has been used to certain projects in Africa if we are not able to show results. So this is something which is high on our priority list, because we have to have this accountability. And I can tell you that it is not very easy always to convince our partners in Africa and elsewhere, especially the finance ministers, why we need to stick to these procedures. But from our perspective, in order to maintain the legitimacy among our citizens to these different operations, it's important to have this evaluation and also those indicators.
As promised, now it's your chance to participate with questions, with remarks. There is a microphone in the room. If you want, please raise your hand. I see, well, several hands up there. So let's start with you. Would you be so nice to identify yourself briefly?
My name is Diane Robbers. I'm from Hans Seidel Foundation. Actually, I'm also an innovation professor. So my question would be to Mr. Gates, talking about the entrepreneurial attitude that you have against state or European political initiatives. So what's your vision on Africa with your foundation? What's your attitude, having been or still being an entrepreneur? And what are your measures that you are doing, or your goals that are different from what we see from political issues?
Mr. Gates?
Yeah. Well, the foundation spends about half of its resources in upstream. So that's things like creating new bed nets, HIV vaccine, understanding anemia, understanding maternal deaths, and coming up with new products to deal with those things. And that pipeline is really amazing. And it's very similar for the seeds and livestock that we fund those CG centers and various universities to make crops that are both more productive and deal with these temperature and water, too much water, too little water, which sadly comes with climate change. So we're able to measure the innovation portfolio. It's even easier to measure the other half, which is the delivery portfolio. Of all the areas of foreign aid that we've matured so that we avoid significant corruption and we see the outcomes, global health is a very well-run activity. We know when the vaccines get there. We know our impact on maternal deaths, childhood deaths, the measurement of malnutrition just in the last few years, not just the height and weight, but also now we're looking at brain development. And what we see is just horrific that these diets don't allow that development. And so that's a metric. As we bring new foods in to the mix, we'll be able to look literally at that intellectual potential which has been destroyed there. So it's every bit as numeric as the work I did at Microsoft. It just doesn't have a profit. The number that's the most exciting for us is that when we got started, 10 million children died every year, and now 5 million die every year. And that's not just us, that's partners. That's German aid budget, UK aid budget, but it's things like Gavi Now, bringing into other areas of development that same type of measurement, because of digital tools, we should be able to do better. And the climate adaptation work is just at the beginning of, there's a lot of wasted money under that heading today, but it will get more sophisticated.
A question from the lady in the back. And would you be so nice to stand up? Thank you so
indeed.
much.
Thank you so much. I am Professor Fumi Olonishaki, Vice President at King's College London, but also Professor of Security, Leadership and Development. I came here especially because I was interested in seeing what and if any attempt is being made to integrate what I see as isolated strategies. The European strategy, when you're talking about strategic autonomy, is excellent, but without dealing with the structural roots of what makes Africa unequal to the rest of the world, we cannot actually achieve that. I like the approach of industry manufacturing those medicines in Africa, but it's not sufficient. Mr. Gates, your proposals for Africa, they're really good, but they're in isolation of that strategic autonomy. They're also in isolation of the fact that raw materials come out of Africa without any industries to give employment to those young people. So as far as I'm concerned, I would like to hear your integrated strategies for education, health, establishment of industry, instead of taking out raw materials without any compensations. Thank you.
I think the question is for the Commissioner. Please.
Well, I have to say that I fully agree with you, because we have to be able to create value in Africa. And I already referred to our example with Namibia now, when we are creating this roadmap in terms of green hydrogen, but also critical raw materials. We can not only take out of those minerals from or raw materials from Namibia and ship them to Europe or elsewhere. We have to be able to support Namibia in order to create their own industry and create value also in their own society. And this is the European approach. This is not the approach of all geopolitical and I would say international actors. We know that, but this is the European approach. This is something we want to do and support in African states. You refer to education. This is my personal priority as a commissioner. I decided to increase our funding to education from 7% to 13%. So 13% of our external funding goes to education, because we believe that that's the most transformative tool to be used in our partner countries. It means that we are investing in access to basic education, especially for girls, also teacher training, which I already mentioned, and in addition to that, also vocational education and training. So this is definitely high on our agenda. And I would say in general, we also have to pay more attention to young people. If we have a continent where 70% of the citizens are under 30 years old. So that's why we also have to create more opportunities for them to be part of society, for them to really make an impact and influence. And this is also one of our priorities in our relationship with Africa.
The gentleman over there and then the lady here. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone.
Would you stand up, please?
Okay.
Thank you.
I am Babatunde Shioye. I think I'm actually going to give a sort of a statement and a question. I think if one looks at the problems of Africa, I think they're just so complex, so multifaceted. I think to try to solve everything is, I think, take AI with quantum computing. I don't know how many decades to try to solve it. So I think if one tries to just chop the problems and issues up into two blocks, then I think we'll start trying to make headway. So if we start actually from the fact that if you look across the continent, I'll look at sub-Saharan Africa, I sort of exclude North Africa from the equation. Something like anything between 10 and 20% of GDP and 50% of foreign exchange income is spent on importing food and energy. Yeah? just trying to address those two things, I think, Africa has got wind, it's got solar, it's got all the natural resource. So fixing the current account deficit in Africa through fixing agriculture, reducing imports, and fixing green energy, but actually through the provision of actually equity, because what we find is a lot of European organizations, DFIs, and everyone is giving, and Chinese is giving debt. Debt it helps, but it doesn't solve the problem. It just creates more problems down the road. So trying to find a way to provide equity rather than debt to fix agriculture and infrastructure for energy using renewables and green stuff. If you just prioritize those two things, will go a long way to fixing the current account deficits of these countries. And then from there, things can take off.
Thank you for your statement. Do you want to add something, Mr. Fuest?
Yes, I fully agree. What just came to my mind is that maybe this European desire to cooperate in energy, produce hydrogen using African solar, should be linked to conditions about electrification. We've just heard the Commissioner mention that we have countries in Africa that aren't even electrified. So do we really think we can use large amounts of electricity to produce hydrogen, export the hydrogen to Europe in countries that aren't even electrified? This will create political tensions. This will not be sustainable. And I think it's just one example where we Europeans look at our problems and think about how Africa can solve these problems. We say, okay, they should produce our hydrogen because they have the solar. I think that strategy is unsustainable if we don't combine it with a strategy for electrification, which will lay the basis for industrialization. How do you put that in practice? I don't know, but it's at least one thing which is relatively concrete and limited. Otherwise, I fully agree with your point about the complexity. So you need to focus on something, and that would be a possibility.
One last question. I'm sorry, we have to wrap up. So this is the last one.
Nari Woods, Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. And I guess my question is mostly to Mr. Gates. How important for Africa will it be to create public digital infrastructure in India style to create inclusive economies?
Yeah, so our foundation's the largest funder in that area, starting with the Kenya M-Pesa, and then what we did with the Central Bank of India to create the regulations. Being able to do savings on a digital basis and do transactions on a digital basis is pretty phenomenal, because government aid programs, when they were cash disbursement, you had to come, get the money, so there's huge overhead in that, and then some of that money gets diverted in that distribution process. During the pandemic, there were great things done with these payment systems. We're now up to, if you go to the year 2000, 23% of Indians had a bank account, huge gender disparity. Now 78% have bank accounts, no gender disparity. We've gotten the employers in Bangladesh to do things digitally. The government payment programs in India are being moved digitally. And the cost to do these things is very small. You're not having to subsidize the cell phone or the airtime. You're simply getting the financial regulations in place. These have nothing to do with cryptocurrency. This is local currency. These are attributed, reversible transactions. Banks' fees are very expensive. They don't work well for small transaction in Africa. One of the big things we're doing now is cross-border, where you have different currencies in different countries, and allowing that to work as well. And the G20 meeting, which is in India, will be a chance to highlight the progress on this and talk about which African countries are doing well. Africa has some exemplars. India is the most impressive because they've done a system that preserves privacy and a role for the private sector, which some other systems haven't done.
So we have to wrap up. We have heard a lot of practical examples, but which concrete projects or measures can give hope that this transformative change is really possible? And what can we learn from past attempts to build more partnership of equals? Would you like to start, Mrs. Urpilainen?
Well, very briefly, if I have to mention one, that would be the Global Gateway. Global Gateway strategy is the strategy through which we are really now investing in Africa, not only with the government money, but also together with the private sector, really to accelerate green and digital transitions in the continent, but also investing in human capital like education, health, and research. So this is a high priority to us. I think in the previous part of the discussion, the trade was also mentioned. And definitely we support this African continental free trade area. And we know that also in order to improve internal trade in Africa, it means that we also need to invest in transport. And that's why we have also identified 12 strategic corridors in Africa, and we are also investing in them. So I would say not preach, but listen. That's the way to create equal partnership, to have a real, honest, respectful dialogue, and really walk the talk. This is something which Africa also expects from us. We have to be able to deliver, and we have to be able to show concrete, tangible results on the ground.
Thank you, Mr. Fuest.
I'm very convinced by this idea to focus on a few things, not on everything, but on a few kind of basic things. At the same time, I guess the challenge is certain things interact. As we've heard, you can talk about developing the agriculture, but if you have no infrastructure to transport the goods, it's not really useful. Or how do you convince parents to send their children to education when there are no jobs, when there are no opportunities? So I guess the challenge is to focus on a few clear objectives, the basic things Bill also mentioned, like health, food, but also take into account, I suppose, the economic incentives for people, how they react to these things, and the fact that certain opportunities require a combination of things like infrastructure plus education plus health. Education doesn't help you if you're sick, or not very much at least. So it's probably, let's call it a handful of basic things, and we should really concentrate on them and also have accountability, maybe not so much to our taxpayers, but in terms of policy. So the evaluation is important to understand whether our policies actually have an impact.
And your lessons?
Well, the measurability and benefits of development aid has improved quite dramatically over the last several decades, which is why it's unfortunate that the amount going into Africa will be down until we get through this war period. The debt situation, we need to shine a light on that because it's completely holding countries back. I do think visits where you go and see the stuff on the ground are very valuable. As we get politicians out and they can see how women are sending their kids to school when they have better agricultural productivity. And I do think, saving lives is a priority. I don't know what, is that equal? It's their priority. The three largest African countries, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and DRC, are quite unstable, and the governments are imperfect. The thing that has managed to cut through that is these agricultural innovations and health innovations. It'd be good if the education sector developed that same sophistication. There's not much correlation between aid and educational outcomes today. The other area is the infrastructure, where that too, there's not a great correlation between aid and what actually happened with the infrastructure. But it doesn't mean we should give up. It means we should take the lessons that the best work in health and agriculture provide to us and apply those to education and infrastructure.
We have heard at the beginning from Bill Gates, the big challenge is Africa. we have heard it's complex. And the commissioner said at the end, well, not preach, but listen. So thank you for listening. I think we have learned a lot about an important topic about Africa. And thank you for sharing your views and lessons with us. Thank you so much.